For our next section, we now want to take a look at the actual wireless LAN controller graphical user interface. And we might even start out in the command line. Let's go ahead and bring up the command line. And let's go ahead and just SSH over with the login of admin to 10.1.1.21. Now, this would typically be a console. We would have consoled in to begin with. And we would have gone ahead and set up the beginning interface. I'm not sure if I have SSH enabled on this particular device. Maybe I have it turned off right now. We'll go ahead and come back to that. But we would have consoled in to begin with, and we would have set up the static IP address for at least the service port and probably the management port, essentially, or at least the management port for all switches, and the service port probably for some various switches that had it, like the 4400 and 5500 series. So our username is admin, and we'll put in our password, which happens to be INE Wi-Fi 1. It likes strong passwords. And we begin on the monitor page. That's where it starts us out. Okay, so there's a number of things that I actually already have configured here, and we'll be, but plenty of things I've gone through and deleted. We'll be going through and creating and deleting, so we'll certainly get to a lot of things here in the WLC. I will say, just right off the bat, we're not going to be covering absolutely everything in the wireless LAN controller because it's beyond the scope of this particular course and would take a lot longer. We will be covering absolutely everything in the wireless LAN controller and just about everything in the wireless control system, the WCS server, in the next CCNP wireless class, because we really do have to go into all the different various aspects. We will be covering, I would say, probably 75, maybe 80% of what's here in the wireless LAN controller here in this particular course, and we'll be covering probably about 25% of what's in the wireless control system, because it's really so much more in depth and so much that we can do with that particular system that is not tested on at the CCNA wireless level, but is at the CCNP wireless level. At any rate, you've probably seen this page refreshing. It refreshes every, I think, 30 seconds, it tells us. So just since we're here on the monitor page, I'm not going to go into everything over here yet. We will eventually come back to that, but first we want to go into the configuration. But since we're just on this summary page, let's just take a look. We see a summary of the controller, a summary of our access points, a summary of clients. We see a summary of rogue APs, clients, ad hoc rogues, rogues on the wired network. We see the top wireless LANs, their profile name and the number of clients, and most recent traps. Okay, so we'll be taking a look at a lot of this stuff. The controller summary, the management IP address, we see what is set up. We see the 10.1.1.21. We see the current software version, an emergency fallback version. So it basically has another copy of the wireless LAN controller software just in case there's a problem. Maybe we upgraded to a newer image. Let's say we upgrade to 8.0 when it comes out. 7.0.230.0 will be the emergency image at that point. We can always fall back to it. That way we can have a recovery if for some reason there's some sort of catastrophic bug in the new version. We can see the system name if we haven't changed it. Currently, it is basically the MAC address. This is the last 6 characters of the MAC address. Cisco defines basically the vendor, so that is the definition for the first 6 characters of that MAC address. We can see how long this has been up, what the system time is, internal temperature in Celsius, whether A networks are enabled, whether BG networks are enabled. It doesn't tell us about N, but we do support that as well. Local mobility group, something we'll be talking about a lot more later. Current CPU and memory usage. We can see how many 802.11an radios there are and BGN. Why does it group those together? Well, AN is going to be the 5 gigahertz range. So N is on both. That's because N here is a 5 gigahertz N range radio, and N for BGN is in the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum. Okay, so there are 4 radios that support at least BG and A each, and some of them support N. APs in total, we have 4. We can click on detail on all APs, or just let's say we only want to look at the 5 gigahertz N radios, or at least the 5 gigahertz AN radios, and we can see their particular MAC addresses. Okay, in fact, if we were to go back to our switch that we had looked at bindings, we could see if we match any of these. Whoops. Let's just leave that for right now because these are the base radio MAC addresses, and we would be from the switch looking at the Ethernet MAC addresses. So we'll come back to that. Okay, we can see, remember we were on the 5 gigahertz spectrum, so we can see what channel those are broadcasting on. These appear to be broadcasting on the same channel, 161, so that's something that we might want to consider and deal with. The power level that they're at, we'll talk about what that power level means, whether clean air is administratively administratively enabled and then operationally up or not. 3 of these radios don't support it. The 3502 does. It's enabled and up. We'll talk about where to configure that and take a look at actual interference. Okay. So we'll just go back to the summary page. We can see how many rogue APs. We can actually see 52 rogue APs on our network and 14 rogue clients. Now keep in mind, where I am working out of, this is a building where we share, in fact, specifically where I'm working out of is a remote office, and I actually just lease a single office space. So I&E has our corporate headquarters in Seattle and also in Reno, and we have an entire floor in Seattle, an entire almost building in Reno for our data center. But I'm just working out of a remote individual, small 100 square foot office. So I not only share the floor and the building with other people, I share the next office with other people. I should say there are people on either side of me and in front and behind me in different offices. So there are a lot of APs that my APs here are picking up and probably causing interference too. And in fact, as soon as this class is done, I take them down. I don't have antennas on a lot of them because I don't want to cause too much interference. But if I click detail, I can actually see how many other APs I'm seeing out there. One of them is one of the ones that is not really, it's actually a separate AP of mine that I'm using. In fact, I showed it to you in the SSID when we were looking at RSSI and signal to noise ratio the other day. These are not the ones that I'm using for my class. This is just my actual production one. But we can see other things like guest WLAN, that's not mine. PS Wireless, that's actually the company that I rent from, PS Executive Centers, that's their wireless for all the clients, all their internal office people, all sorts of one. Okay, so there's all sorts of wireless networks around. And we can see how many clients each of these APs have. So I'm detecting 3 radios on the PS Wireless SSID. I'm detecting 4 radios on the I&E voice rack. And I'm detecting number of clients on APs that are not mine. How can I do that? Because their management frames are sent on channels that I have radios that listen on, and they're not protected. Now, there's plenty of these that don't have any clients able to be detected. That is they probably don't actually have no clients, right? They probably actually do have clients, is another way to say that double negative. They probably have management frame protection turned on. That would be the smart thing. And since there is a big corporate customer here, I won't name them. I don't think it's too clear from the actual naming of this. Then, just for their own privacy reasons, then it would make sense that since they're a multinational company that occupies a large portion of the building, that they actually do have robust security setup. In fact, they're probably detecting mine as rogues as well. In fact, we have 3 pages of these. So I've got a lot of information here. Okay. I also could see the rogue clients. Look at this. I can actually, these are the MAC addresses of the particular clients, and I can click on any one of these, see what SSID they're associated to, and I can't do anything to them. Okay, I'm not going to actually, our APs are not going to cause interference with them. They're not actually going to try and disrupt them in any way. In fact, Cisco Clean Air is not there to disrupt other people's networks. Technically, under, at least in the US, under FCC guidelines, that's illegal and very punishable by law, right? So we're not doing that even with Clean Air. We're simply detecting what we see, and we're able to act on it for our environment. So I can do something like alert my own systems based on that, okay? Or I can say that particular rogue client has been contained, okay? So I can try to deal with that in that way. All right, so we're not going to go and do anything to any of these rogue clients. I don't see any ad hoc rogue networks. They're all infrastructure based, okay? I don't see any rogues on the wired network. One, because I don't have anything in the monitor state. I don't have any APs in the purely monitor state, or in the rogue AP state. But I also am not on the same wired LAN as them. Well, I sort of am as some of them, but I have, of course, being a CCNA security, a very robust firewall in between me and them. Okay, I can also click on these MAC addresses of the actual APs. I can classify these APs as friendly or malicious, and state whether to alert on them or not. I can see specifically what channel they're broadcasting, the width of their the bandwidth of their channel, 20 megahertz wide channel, 802.11g. WEP is enabled. Probably it's actually not. WPA is really enabled, being a extension to WEP. So in other words, they're not using WEP, they're using WPA. All things in security we'll talk about, whether they're using a long or short preamble, what their RSSI is, and what their signal to noise ratio is. In fact, actually, this particular AP is my own AP, Sales Support Floor AP. So that's the rogue that I was seeing there, which is actually interesting. That must be a leftover wireless LAN that I need to deal with. So we'll get to that. I don't have any, because I've deleted them all, any wireless LANs at this point. We're going to talk about the traps. We're going to talk about how to create traps and go take a look at those later. And we will see clients on our network once we begin actually adding those. And we'll go take a look at some of the more detailed information about these statistics and Clean Air and stuff as we go on. But let's go ahead and get started with the basics of the wireless LAN controller. And so we're actually going to start over here at commands. First of all, if I go to feedback, it's going to pop up a window saying, hey, do you want to give Cisco feedback? It goes out to the live web. Do you want to provide feedback on network control system, Prime, WCS, WLCs, APs, or the mobility services engine? I'm not here for that. Okay, you're not here for that. Help. This is going to be an extremely important and helpful, believe it or not, feature. So use it. Anytime we have, now it's not quite as helpful as some Cisco servers where they provide context-sensitive help, where it actually says help for this page, and it actually pulls up the exact page you're on. You still have to go to whatever it is you're wanting to do. But if you take a look at it, if I pull it over here just a little bit, it mimics the, or has an index for the configuration interface that we're looking at. So first of all, it tells you how to use the web user interface. Then it says I've got the monitor tab, the WLANs tab, the controller tab, the wireless tab, the security tab, the management tab, the commands, and then any disclaimers. So if I need to go set up, let's say, management on the device, and I want to know how to set up SNMP v3 with security, I can actually go here and it will give me information about the parameter on that particular page. So if I go here to management SNMP, SNMP v3, and I click New, here I'm getting the information about, let's see, username, access level, access protocol, privacy protocol. It's kind of giving me, albeit I probably chose a very minimalist one to look at, but maybe I need something, you know, more advanced, like how do I set up an LDAP server, or what do each of the parameters on the LDAP server mean? I can go to, you know, I know it's going to be under security and then under LDAP, and then I can say, first of all, learn a little bit about it in general, go to new and see all sorts of information about setting up, even things like the LDAP search base, and you know how to actually format that particular search base. Okay, so it's use the help command or the help page. It's going to be very useful. But let's go back to commands. We can download files to the controller, or we can also upload files to the controller. So we can basically say, you know, we want to have a TFTP server. I should maybe clarify this. We're not setting up a TFTP server on the WLC. We're saying we have a TFTP server at this IP address, and we've put in the name of the new WLC 2100, you know, K9, which is a security load, 7.0.230.0, which is actually separated by dashes in the file name, .aes. Okay. And the file path, so this is actually when I had set up my TFTP server on my laptop. My laptop was IP address 10.1.1.15, or sorry, 1.1.1.15 at the time. Maybe it would be 10 now. And I would say we're going to basically update the version of code on the controller via TFTP, or if I did FTP, it would change all the credentials down here and include things like username, password. FTP not being trivial like TFTP is. And I could say download, and it would go out and look for that TFTP server and try to download the newest configuration. I could also do things like upload vendor certificates or configurations or signature files. Okay, I could also grab event logs. This is actually, I think this is kind of backwards the way I think of it. Download, it's saying download to the WLC, and it's saying upload from the WLC. All right, so this is basically pushing out to you the event log of the WLC, or the trap log of the WLC, or the configuration of the WLC, or pack files for something we'll talk about in a little bit, protected EAP, which is a security mechanism. And download, I'm actually downloading to the WLC, the configuration, or the new code, or a vendor-based certificate, or a login banner for a web authentication proxy. Okay, so we're downloading to and uploading from the WLC. I can, of course, reboot with or without save. I can look at the boot image. Do I want to boot to the primary or backup? I can schedule a reboot. I can reset the entire system to factory default. We're not going to do that. I can set the time. Okay, and I can create a login banner if I like. So that's on the commands. We're now going to go over to management, and we see a summary. Currently, HTTP is disabled, but HTTPS SSL version is enabled. So port 80 isn't going to work. Port 443 will. Telnet sessions are not allowed. SSH sessions are allowed, but I believe that the problem is I don't have... We're actually going to take a look and see what the problem was. I wasn't able to SSH in earlier, so we'll take a look at that now. But that's the summary. SNMP, we can set up traps, SNMP version 1 or 2, and then also version 3. We can set up communities, who's going to receive those traps, okay, what traps, what is it we want to trap? We'll actually look at that with clean air a little bit later, what specific events we want to trap. HTTP and HTTPS. So I can enable HTTP if I want to do management over that. For Telnet SSH, I do have SSH turned on. Let's turn on Telnet as well. I'll click Apply. Very simple. For the serial port, we can set the baud rate if we want to connect higher at 19.2 or what have you. The 8 bits, one stop bit, parity on, flow control off, that's hard-coded. Local management users, I have my default admin. I can add a new user with a password and then give them read-only so they can log on and monitor, or read-write. Lobby admin is something else that I have configured. We'll take a look at that. And I can also just, this is kind of an interesting piece of this particular, of actually all wireless LAN controllers, this particular acquisition by Cisco, is the fact that we've got these little down-facing arrows that you don't actually click, and be careful that you don't, because it's not like a web button where you click it and then choose what drop-down or what value you want from the drop-down, but as soon as you mouse over it, it gives you an option, and you might accidentally click remove. Now, I don't think it would let us, it's first of all going to prompt us to be sure, but I don't think it would let us, it looks like it would actually let us delete the last read-write user. I don't know why it would. The only way it would is if we have an alternate database such as Radius set up to authenticate, which we don't right now. So this, if I wanted to create a new user to log in, I could do that there. I can see what sessions I have. I don't have any in command line sessions currently. We can take a look at logs, when to trap certain logs, what facility. Do I want to trap debug or just errors or alerts? Okay, what syslog facility do I want to write them to? How much of, or what do I want to write to my buffered log? Do I want to just write errors? Do I want to do all level debugging? Do I want to look at console level? So if I actually want to look at maybe debugging from the console, I could go ahead and say apply from here and then plug into the serial console and begin monitoring debugs there. Is management via wireless turned on? I'm managing via wired. So my laptop has an Ethernet. I'm actually broadcasting through my wireless through my production network, but I have a wired network card to, and I think mine is 10.1.1.15, and that's how I'm actually managing this wireless LAN controller, is over the wired network. If I wanted to manage over wireless, I would have to specifically allow that. This is a safety or protection mechanism to not allow wireless users to be able to get to the WLC to make any changes. And then various things about technical support if you happen to need to call TAC or just want to take a look at, what's the CPU, what are the system buffers, if there was a crash, if there was a core dump, do I want to transfer that to a single IP address? Have there been APs, access points, that have crashed? If so, what's their name? What's their ID? What's their current status? We're not going to take a look at security yet because we will be coming, of course, to security. But for and that's going to be a whole few modules all by itself. First of all, we'll take a look at all the concepts, and that'll be a fairly in-depth discussion. And you'll become somewhat of a mini security guru. And then we'll take a look at the command line interface, or at least that and the GUI interface to see how to set that up for our given wireless LANs. So even when we come to setting up our WLANs, our SSIDs, to begin with, we won't be setting up any security. We'll just bypass that and come back to that later. So I'm going to skip over security for now. I'm going to skip over wireless for now, which deals more with the APs and the radios and their specific configurations. And I'm going to continue setting up the controller. So let's go to controller. So here we're on the general tab, and we've got some general things that we can look at. The name of the controller, I could rename this to WLC 1. Let's go ahead and do that. 802.3x flow control mode. We're not going to deal with that. Or broadcast. We're not going to deal with multicast in this class. Fast SSID change. That's actually something that we'll cover a lot more in depth in the mobility subclass of the CCNP wireless. We are going to, as I mentioned, be talking soon about mobility, the basics of mobility and roaming. And so the default mobility name and RF group name will become important. Let's actually name that RF domain. And so we'll just go ahead and click apply for now. We will be coming back to these, okay? We'll be coming back to these. Just keep in mind that's where they are, is on controller general. Okay, we're not dealing with web authentication proxy yet. We'll take a look at that in security. Let's take a look at inventory. I see the burned-in MAC address, the model number, the maximum number of APs that I can support. Okay. The chassis, the serial number, the product ID. Let's go on to interfaces. So I have interfaces and I also have ports. Let's actually look at ports first. So I see that I have port number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 on this particular device, this 2106. Power over Ethernet is actually provided from this particular wireless LAN controller on 2 ports. It's a 2106. It's a smaller, really kind of a small office, branch office type of a wireless LAN controller. So is the 2504, its replacement. And so PoE is actually supported on 2 of these ports. That means I can basically power 2 access points directly from this wireless LAN controller. And while I wouldn't recommend it, you could, plug a few additional clients into these ports as well. Okay, but I can actually power a few APs for a very, very small environment. Currently, while the PoE is enabled there, the link is down. The physical status is in automatic. Physical mode is in automatic. The administrative status is enabled. I haven't disabled the port manually, but the link is down on ports 3 through 8. Ports 1 and 2, we can see that the link is up, and we have 100 megabit full duplex automatically negotiated. And I can click on any one of these ports. So I can manually disable the port. I can change it from a physical mode of auto to 100 full, 100 half, or 10 full. And then I can tell this particular port whether it should trap any traps or not, whether those traps should be written to syslog or not, and whether power over Ethernet's available. I haven't changed anything, so I won't hit apply. I could, let's say go to port 3 and disable it. And then when I go back, we'll see that this has been disabled. So those are my physical ports. Now we're going to go back and look at the interfaces. So we said that we had, there was one other interface that tied directly to a port, and that was called a service port / interface. That's only on the 4400 and the 5500 series. So I don't have that on this particular smaller SOHO or small office branch office wireless LAN controller. I do have my AP manager and my management and my virtual interface. Remember we said, whoops, I don't know why I'd put that in 10.5.5.1. Probably because I hadn't decided to make that a guest net yet. Let's just make that 1.1.1.1 as we mentioned. And it wants us to restart the system for that to take effect. We'll do that on a break. But that doesn't need to be a pingable IP address. This is going to be used for mobility and for something related to security called web authentication proxy. Things we'll talk about in mobility and security modules, respectively. But I have my management interface where I'm going to interact with my WLC and manage it. So 10.1.1.21 is clearly the IP I am pointing to. And then the AP or access point manager interface. This will be the source of the DTLS or CAPWAP or LWAP tunnel. Talking to my actual access points. Now remember that we pointed the IP helper address to the management interface. So they will initially set up and begin talking to the management interface, but the AP manager interface will quickly become their understood source or destination for traffic coming to the APs or going away from them, respectively. So I can click on any one of these. I can map this AP manager to a physical port. I can give it a VLAN identifier. I can deal with IP address, netmask gateway, primary DHCP server, and we do even have the ability to, under security, we'll talk about later, create access control lists and then apply those to the virtual interfaces. Okay. Look at my management interface. We're not going to deal with quarantine. In fact, 200 would not be at all what I would want to use to quarantine it anyhow. But, oops, that's fine. But I'm mapping it to a physical port. And we're going to take a look in a moment at something called an interface group, multiple groupings of interfaces. But for right now, let's just take a look at the interfaces in general. So this is my management AP, or my management interface. My AP manager is a different interface. So let's go create a new interface. And specifically, let's name this one sales. And the VLAN ID needs to match. So what we're doing right now, even though it doesn't say it, we're creating a dynamic interface. Remember, the term dynamic, especially for your exam, is going to be synonymous with VLAN. So if we take a look back at our VLANs, VLAN 20 was going to be our sales. I'm sorry, VLAN 10 is our sales interface. So let's take and say VLAN ID 10 is interface name sales interface, or sales int. Now, this isn't, again, the naming here has nothing to do with each other. The VLAN ID is everything. So the VLAN ID is exactly what will ultimately take and map this interface to a newly created wireless LAN SSID. But it will be the VLAN ID that actually makes that connection. So we'll say apply. Let's map it to a port number. We had port number, let's see, show CDP neighbor. Notice the name is now changed for CDP because we changed the host name from Cisco underscore last 6 characters of the MAC address to WLC1. So it's updated accordingly, the CDP update, the CDP hello. And I think it was fast 020. Where we have the multiple VLANs allowed. And so that local switch, VLAN 20, was the remote WLC port 2. So we want to map this to port 2. The VLAN identifier is 10. What was the actual VLAN 10 IP? It was 10.1.1.1. Let's say 10.1.1.21. Let's just make all of these on the WLC 21, since we know that 10.1.1.21 is my management interface. We'll make all the different subnets end in the host address of 21 just to keep everything easy to remember. So the gateway will be .1. Why? Because that is the gateway IP address here of the switch virtual interface. That will be our default gateway. DHCP server. Whoops. DHCP server will be, really it's going to be on the same subnet, so it doesn't really matter, but we'll go ahead and put that there. We're not going to assign any ACL. We're also in no way dealing with quarantine. Okay, this has to do with security. It has to do with something called NAC, or network access control, and we're not going to be dealing with that in this class. That is another class for security in CCNP wireless. Okay, so we've got this. Notice the interface type. These are static interfaces for AP Manager, static for management. We can't do anything with them, and static for the virtual interface. Those three always exist. What's the other one that might exist? the service port and service interface. The dynamic interface is mapped to a VLAN. The rest are untagged. The only thing I can really do is I can come over here, click and remove it, or I could actually click on that name and drop down and make any changes if I want to. So we're going to add another interface, and we'll call this the support int. VLAN ID is 20. Port number 2. IP address 10.20.20.21. /24 subnet mask. Default gateway of 10.20.20.1. Same primary DHCP server because the switch is that IP. Oh, and it's just simply telling me that the when I put this in, I accidentally put in .21 as the DHCP server. It was telling me that I couldn't put in when I had 21 here. I'll just hit apply again. It was telling me that I couldn't put the interface IP address cannot also be the DHCP server. Well, the wireless LAN controller can be a DHCP server. We're about to look at that here with internal DHCP server. It's just that I don't need it doesn't need you to tell it that itself is the DHCP server. It will hear the DHCP requests from the clients and serve them. This is mainly for DHCP relaying. Okay, so we've got our sales interface and our support interface, dynamic interfaces mapped to those proper VLANs. Let's go ahead and create our guest. Guest wireless LAN interface, and that will be VLAN 5. Okay, 10.5.5.21, 2550 for the subnet, /24, 10.5.5.1 for the gateway, and also for the DHCP server. Again, since the DHCP server is on the same subnet, I don't really even need to do that. I didn't set the port number, so it didn't take anything there. And it's just telling me every time that changing the interface parameters might cause the wireless LANs to be temporarily disabled and loss of connectivity. We don't have them defined yet, so it's not a big deal. So now I've got my 3 dynamic, what I'm going to use for my wireless LAN to VLAN ID mapping interfaces created. I've still got my management, my AP manager, and my virtual interface. IPs assigned to all of them. And we're ready to move on. Now, let's say I wanted to have multiple interfaces for support. Maybe let's say I wanted to have, let's say, support interface 2, VLAN 20. Oops. Sorry. Let's just look at the interface group. Let's say I wanted to take and say I want to create a grouping. My client just powered down over here. So I can create a group. Let's say support group. I can create an interface, and then what I can actually do is add, if I want to, multiple interfaces to this particular interface group. So if for some reason I wanted to have, we'll see as we go on. In fact, naming the support group might not have been the, let's remove this and call it something else. Let's call it sales and support. Might be a little more intuitive. If for some reason later on I might want to reference both the sales and support interfaces in one area, I can do that by creating an interface group and adding both existing already created interfaces to that particular interface group. Notice I can only add dynamically created interfaces or the management interface. I I cannot do the AP manager, and I cannot do the virtual. The virtual, because really that's just used, like I said, for mobility and auth proxy. And then the AP manager is just used for talking to the APs, whereas the management can actually pass traffic back and forth. Okay, we're not going to talk about multicast for right now. We will go on and take a look at DHCP server integrated within the wireless LAN controller. So the wireless LAN controller can, and we're going to create these and then we're going to delete them very quickly. Why are we going to delete them? Because I already have DHCP scopes set up here for my clients on my switch. And while I wouldn't necessarily serve them from a switch or a router, I might in a production environment, but probably I'd serve them from a little bit more robust, redundant DHCP server infrastructure. Okay, I probably would never do it from a WLC, or I might do it from a switch or a router in a small office, but I probably wouldn't do it from a WLC. Just like you can make Cisco Call Manager or Unified Communications Manager a DHCP server too for phones, but don't know why you really would. Okay, I would have that aggregated and centralized somewhere. At any rate, it is important to know how to do it. So let's create a scope name. We'll call it sales. Again, this is going to overlap with my existing sales pool, but I'm going to delete it. I'm only doing it for the sake of demonstration. So I can right or mouse over to remove. I can click on sales to begin configuring. So the pool start address would be 10. I think sales was 10.10.10.0. Let's just say begin address might be .100 and the end address might be 150. The network would of course be .0. The subnet mask would be 255.255.255.0. The lease time in seconds. Default router .1. Might have multiple default routers. Domain name ine.com. DNS server, I don't know, 8.8.8.8. NetBIOS name servers. Nobody uses that anymore, do they? Wins? Anyhow, and the status would be enabled. Apply, and I have a lease time of 1 day, 86,400. The sales scope is active. It's enabled. It's ready to serve. Is it allocating any leases? We're going to go ahead and delete it before it does, but we can click here on DHCP allocated leases, which is the same thing in the switch as doing show IP DHCP binding, seeing what we've actually handed out. We actually don't have any fear of handing anything out yet because we don't have any clients in any wireless LANs. We don't have any wireless LANs for that matter just yet. So I'm going to go ahead and remove it. But that is how I would create a DHCP scope. It's actually telling me that I have to first disable it and hit apply before I can remove it. Okay, so we've created it and we've removed it. We're going to be coming back to mobility management because we're going to be talking about mobility groups, anchor config, and we'll not be doing multicasting in this particular CCNA wireless class, but mobility will be important. We're going to do a whole conceptual slide animation, hopefully helping you to understand the need for mobility and what different types of mobility we have and need to configure for before we actually show any of the configuration. Kind of makes sense. Back at management, we could manually set time. Here on controller, we have the ability to also set up NTP. So we can actually point to an NTP server, typically a good idea, and define keys if we want to authenticate if the NTP server is protected. That way, our time is synchronized. It's always a good idea in every environment to run NTP on every device. That way, when I take a look at any sort of troubleshooting or I'm trying to detect any malicious activity, all my logs are dated and time-stamped with accurate, synonymous time with every other device. Cisco Discovery Protocol, I can basically say, is it enabled? Is version 2, the latest version, enabled? What's the hello time and the hold time before I flush out known neighbors. Okay, CDP is a layer 2 protocol. And then dealing with something called, first of all, am I going to enable DHCP proxy? Is option 82. Basically, am I going to put the MAC address of the AP as well as the MAC address maybe of the SSID, the MB SSID in the actual remote field as I send DHCP on to the particular IP address that I had configured when I had configured my dynamic interface and I put down the IP address of a DHCP server. Okay. Option 82 can help. In fact, it even carries information about port if so desired, especially for Metro Ethernet and things like that. You can read more about the industry standard. Just Google DHCP option 82. But DHCP proxy is enabled by default. That is to say, if I see someone on one of my interfaces and I have primary DHCP server or possibly secondary configured, I will forward those requests on. Okay. Master controller mode. Master controller mode is something we talked briefly about redundancy and how I can have a primary, secondary, and tertiary controller. I can actually even have a primary backup and a secondary backup on top of that. There's also something called master controller mode. This is basically like a last resort fallback. Okay, it can control when no one else can, but I don't have this set up as it, and I'm not going to set this up as a master controller. But if we wanted to, it's as simple as enabling it.